Mexican. No one loves life more than we do in a way because we are so conscious about death.
Próxima estación, San Juan de Dios.
Hay personas que a cada rato se andan limpiando porque tienen bastante comezón, tienen ardor. Aplíquense las cosas.
Pase, amiga, siéntese. ¿Qué le vamos a servir? Tengo menudo, pozole, birria, huevitos al gusto. Hay chilaquiles, carne asada, enchiladas, taquitos, flautas, sopes, lonches, gringas. Pase, amiga, siéntese. Estamos aquí para servirle.
Nuestra generala. ¡Viva María! ¡Que viva! ¿Para quién? ¡A Jesús!
Distinguidos participantes, estudiantes, docentes, funcionarias y funcionarios de Jalisco, México y el mundo. Me complace darles la más cordial de las bienvenidas a la Cumbre de Ciencias de la Ciudad 2020 que organizamos conjuntamente la Universidad de Guadalajara y el Instituto Tecnológico de Massachusetts. La crisis sanitaria global provocada por el COVID-19 ha obligado a la humanidad entera a cambiar y a modificar muchos de los planes que se habían establecido para este año, y este evento no fue la excepción. Originalmente esperábamos recibirlos en persona en Guadalajara, una ciudad vibrante e innovadora, la segunda más grande de México con casi 5 millones de habitantes y 9 municipios que conforman su área metropolitana. No obstante, gracias a la tecnología, la creatividad y el trabajo de muchas personas en ambas instituciones organizadoras, la Cumbre de Ciencias de la Ciudad 2020 llega hasta ustedes en la modalidad a distancia. Desde el 2017, en la Universidad de Guadalajara, formamos parte de la red de laboratorios de ciencias de la ciudad lideradas por el MIT. En este contexto, nos llena de orgullo que nuestra ciudad y la Universidad de Guadalajara sean la cuarta sede de este encuentro internacional, como lo fue Andorra la Bella en 2017, Shanghái en 2018 y Hamburgo en 2019. Power of Without no es solo el título de la cumbre, es una frase que nos evoca a la búsqueda de soluciones innovadoras y de iniciativas que involucren a la comunidad y a sus instituciones. Las ciudades se erigen como enormes paradojas donde se concentran la innovación, la cultura, los servicios y el crecimiento económico, pero por otro lado, producen pobreza, criminalidad y crisis social. Lamentablemente, esta riqueza y poder cultural no se distribuye siempre equitativamente. Con este espíritu de trabajo, les damos a todas y a todos la más cordial bienvenida y en particular a nuestros socios de la red de laboratorios. Finalmente, los invito a visitar el pabellón de la realidad virtual de la Universidad de Guadalajara en la página oficial del evento, en la que podrán conocer un poco más de nuestra institución, espacios y proyectos de investigación. Muchas gracias a todos los participantes por su asistencia a este encuentro. Estoy seguro que las jornadas de trabajo serán muy productivas y fortalecerán la colaboración internacional de la red para el estudio de las ciudades. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias.
Hablar sobre el futuro de las ciudades es hablar sobre el futuro del mundo. Me da mucho gusto que por primera vez una ciudad de América Latina sea la sede de la Cumbre Mundial de Ciencias de la Ciudad que organiza el MIT. Me da además más gusto que la Universidad de Guadalajara sea parte de este gran esfuerzo por discutir el futuro de las ciudades, particularmente en el caso de América Latina. Estamos seguros que la experiencia que se ha generado en nuestra ciudad para generar gobernanza metropolitana, para crear nuevas instituciones que le den viabilidad a la ciudad que nos imaginamos todos, pueda ser también un espacio y una oportunidad de reflexión sobre la agenda de trabajo que tenemos en el futuro. Es para mí un gran honor poder acompañar este enorme esfuerzo, ser parte de un ejercicio de reflexión en una institución tan prestigiada a escala global como es el MIT y por supuesto que la Universidad de todos los jaliscienses esté acompañando este proceso, sea la sede de este espacio de reflexión que sin duda nos va a aportar muchas experiencias, que nos va a traer nuevas ideas de cómo podemos construir ciudades que verdaderamente pongan a la gente en el centro de atención, que mejoren la calidad de vida de las personas y que sobre todo sean ciudades que entiendan la importancia de poner el medio ambiente y la agenda de la justicia social en el centro de atención de la acción pública. Les mando un abrazo desde Casa Jalisco, mucho éxito en este ejercicio y que la gente que va a acompañar las transmisiones a través de las redes disfruten de un espacio de análisis y de discusión que incorporará a personas de gran experiencia a nivel mundial y que sin duda aportará, insisto, una agenda de trabajo para desarrollar en el futuro las ciudades de México, de América Latina y del mundo.
Hello, I'm Kent Larson, Director of the City Science Group at the MIT Media Lab. Welcome to our 4th Annual City Science Summit hosted virtually by the University of Guadalajara. The theme of this summit is the power of without. Now, what does that mean, the power of without? Well, we're imagining a world without centralized, sometimes destructive systems, with the new, usually lightweight, distributed, responsive, often co-created systems. You'll hear about many of these over the next 3 days. We usually resist framing our work in the negative. After all, without is the absence of something. But I have found that this often helps people let go of their preconceptions, to embrace new opportunities, to think beyond the conventional and increasingly obsolete hierarchical models that we often take for granted. It can communicate a sense of urgency and a need to take action. About the negative, rather than being multidisciplinary, we often speak of our research as being anti-disciplinary. We want to actively break down the artificial boundaries between disciplines, because innovation typically occurs not at the center of a domain, but rather at the intersection of multiple domains. We want engineers to think like designers. We want social scientists to embrace computer science. Likewise, in today's world, it is not enough to just be accepting of other races. We need to be anti-racist, which means actively working to eliminate racism from society. Now, we started thinking about the power of without a few years ago by focusing on emerging technology that could transform slums and informal settlements some point in the future. Places where up to 3.5 billion people are not likely to have access to conventional infrastructure in their communities. We imagined a future of power without grids, sanitation without sewers, water without pipes, food without soil. We prepared a taxonomy of settlement types and a database of emerging technologies that might realize this vision. We then began to apply this thinking to address what I consider to be the major challenge of cities. That is, the settlement patterns that promote long-distance commuting, traffic congestion, wasted resources, pollution, and vast inequalities. One possibility that I'm very excited about is what might be called order without zoning. This is where algorithmic land use regulations replace static regulations and provide dynamic incentives for landowners and real estate developers to create diverse and affordable housing that is in sync with local jobs, and to create walkable access to all of the resources one needs in life. That is shopping, healthcare, recreation, cultural venues, etc. If we can harness market forces through creative public policy, we could achieve a kind of civic homeostasis, which is a community in harmony, much like a natural ecosystem. This could, over time, dramatically reduce energy consumption and simultaneously increase public health, equity, and safety. Now, we're beginning to see hints of a profound transformation, perhaps a trend towards a form of cities without. Cities all over the world are rapidly transitioning to streets without cars. This is Little Italy in Manhattan, where cars are banned and streets became places for people rather than machines. Related to this, cities all over the world are accelerating their plans to provide mobility without cars. Almost overnight, pop-up bike lanes have replaced car lanes, and some cities have largely implemented their 10-year bike infrastructure plan in just the last 6 months. The logical next step towards mobility without cars would be lightweight autonomous mobility modes that provide the convenience of rideshare with bike-like vehicles that come to you on demand, such as our prototype of the persuasive electric vehicle, or an even lighter autonomous bicycle. So I'm so pleased that the researchers in our City Science Network have taken the power of without concept in new and exciting directions, focusing not just on infrastructure and technology, but also design and public policy that can address social issues. Today, during the main stage event, you will hear talks ranging from Mexico without crime, to citizen safety without violence, to data without surveillance. And this will be followed by 3 days of workshops to explore in much greater detail concepts such as equity without zoning, campuses without walls, governance without bureaucrats. So thank you all for helping us explore new and creative possibilities that might help address these challenges, to help us explore the power of without.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hi everyone, nice to have you here.
El día de hoy estamos aquí para presentarles a los ponentes que nos acompañan en la segunda sección de este Summit, en lo que llamamos la serie de Lightning Talks. Unas presentaciones muy cortas de 4 minutos en donde pretendemos presentarles grandes ideas.
This first section will give us a foundation in the power of without, and it will let you know what some of our speakers are thinking of as their vision of how we take this forward in our research. The first speaker today is Lord Norman Foster. If you attended our last summit, you'll remember that he was the keynote speaker there. There he discussed the future of rapidly urbanizing cities. He's in conversation with our director, Kent Larson. They'll discuss the future of architecture and how it can play out in the next coming years.
Nos acompañará también la arquitecta mexicana Frida Escobedo. Ella hablará sobre los aspectos invisibles de la arquitectura y qué tiene que ver con la labor doméstica. Tendremos también al arquitecto y urbanista brasileño Vinicius Neto, quien nos platicará sobre los temas del orden y el desorden y también la segregación urbana. Nos acompaña también Dina Buchbinder, quien tratará su visión de la educación de los niños a través del juego. También el doctor Eduardo Santana, nuestro director del Museo de Ciencias Ambientales en Guadalajara, hablará sobre el aprovechamiento de los museos como instituciones educativas que inspiran la curiosidad. Y finalmente tendremos al doctor Eduardo López Moreno, director de ONU Habitat en México, quien resaltará la importancia de transitar hacia ciudades sin desigualdad.
Enjoy the first section. We'll see you soon.
I'm here with Lord Norman Foster, who built one of the great architecture and engineering firms, Foster and Partners, as well as the Norman Foster Foundation. So Norman, perhaps we can start with some of the issues facing us today by looking back in time. You started your practice in the 1960s at a time when young people were focused on the war in Vietnam, civil rights, women's rights, and the environment. What did you learn from that time that might be relevant to us today?
Kent, the period that you're talking about was also significant in 2 other respects. It was the Cold War. You really did not know whether you were going to wake up in the morning. You know, the world could be annihilated. I mean, we lived with that, and it's very easy to forget it. It was also the birth of what we now call the Green Movement. It hadn't been called that then, but you had writers like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, talking about the chemicals that could destroy the biosphere. You had Buckminster Fuller with his Guide to Spaceship Earth. So it was the 2 opposites the optimism about the future of the planet, but the warning signs about its fragility, and also the imminent threat. So there are parallels.
Well, let's talk about cities. Many people are speculating about what cities will be in the future. And looking at articles in the press, they seem to fall into three general camps. So one, some people think the cities are obsolete. If you can work anywhere, you can live anywhere, why do we need cities? Second camp argues that once we have the vaccine and immunity, everything will quickly go back to normal. And a third camp says that all of the fragilities and inequities that have been revealed by the pandemic will prompt us to make cities more resilient and vibrant. So what do you think the future of cities will be?
I think I'm coming from a fourth camp, which is closer to your last category. The trends which were already apparent will be accelerated, will be magnified. And the story of cities is the story of crises. I mean, the cholera outbreak, which killed thousands in London, technology came to the rescue in terms of sanitation, modern sanitation as we know it. The Thames as a river was an open sewer. It was also an opportunity to create some beautiful elements of London that we take for granted today. The Thames embankment, underground public transport, all of these were spawned by that. So if that was London in the middle of the 19th century, it could be Chicago with the Great Fire, which heralded fireproof construction, high rise. It could be the earthquake of Lisbon, which ushered in anti-seismic structures. It could be the Great Fire of London, which set the DNA of London as we know it. I mean, the Victoria, the Georgian terrace, the brick party walls, the recess windows. So the story of cities is a story of crises and of rebirth and regeneration.
So what positive things do you see happening today that may be the direct result of the pandemic?
Go to Soho now. I mean, entire streets are no longer for traffic, they're for people.
Yeah, I'm aware of a city in Europe that finished their 10-year plan to transform streets for cars into streets for bikes and pedestrians just this year.
It's incredible. I mean, the predicted growth of the e-bike was 3 years. That growth of 3 years has happened in 3 months.
Well, the theme of this summit, as you know, is the power of without, imagining a world without increasingly obsolete centralized infrastructure and with more lightweight responsive systems, ideas that you and I have talked about at length. How can these concepts address the great long-term challenge of our era, which is climate change?
You can't address climate change without concerted, unified global action. But you can make a lot of things locally and avoid a lot of the blockages of the big supply chains. Whether that's drugs that are made in one country or flowers which are grown in another country. So I think this tendency to be able to have sanitation without sewers, to have power without power stations or power lines, to have meat without animals, to have produce without soil. Again, all of these tendencies are here. With time, they'll be magnified. They will be taken for granted in a way that we take so many things for granted, which didn't exist in terms of our grandparents.
So Norman, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for joining us at this City Science Summit, Guadalajara.
Muy contenta de estar aquí. La historia larga un poco más corta. Tengo una oficina en la Ciudad de México y hacemos arquitectura, pero también diseño y arte. Entonces hemos estado siempre como en esta periferia de la arquitectura, en donde no es simplemente arquitectura tradicional, aunque sí lo hacemos. Y también nos gusta mucho hacer investigación. A mí me ha gustado como dar clases porque siento que aprendo más de lo que enseño. Y justo este tema que empezó con arquitectura tradicional, con una comisión de una casa en específico que ahora les puedo mostrar, de estos proyectos que son como difusos y que van tomando como diferentes ramificaciones, pero que al final del día regresan a la arquitectura, ¿no? A la práctica. Hablábamos mucho del sin visibilización, ¿no? O sea, sin que sea evidente, esta idea como de cosas que suceden aunque no las percibimos y cómo la arquitectura es un poco cómplice de ese proceso de invisibilizar ciertas dinámicas sociales. Hace un año salió la película esta de Cuarón, la Roma. Y bueno, parte importante de la película es la arquitectura del espacio, ¿no? Esta es la reconstrucción a partir de lo que vemos en escena. Y como podemos ver, pues en la parte superior hay este pequeño volumen, como afuera de la casa, donde está este cuarto de la trabajadora doméstica que está dentro de la vida de la casa, pero al mismo tiempo como en esta tensión de atracción y de distanciamiento que suceden en estas relaciones que son familiares, pero que también son sociales y económicas. Y que bueno, todo empezó cuando nos comisionaron este proyecto de Ordo 100 en Mongolia. Parte del programa tenía dos cocinas, de la cocina húmeda y la cocina seca. Una cocina en donde realmente se preparaban los alimentos y otra que servía como para display y recibir a la gente. Es algo que trasciende geografías. Entonces un poco era como pensar en una casa que sí es la que realmente es el corazón y el motor de la vivienda, y la que estaba alrededor, que era una vivienda de fin de semana, pues más bien funcionaba como un pabellón mucho más ligero, a revisar que ese tipo de arquitecturas pues se daban en muchos lugares. Y que en México está así muy amarrado al tema de género y al tema de raza y de etnia, ¿no? Se piensa que en realidad lo que debería de suceder es que el trabajo doméstico pagado debería de desaparecer. Pero ¿por qué no, en lugar de pensar que lo tenemos que eliminar, es pensar que lo tenemos que dignificar? Es que lo que se tendría que eliminar son los sistemas de discriminación, ¿no? Y las barreras que excluyen a una parte y dejan en posición de poder a la otra. Y eso otra vez sucede como en diferentes escalas. Entonces, siento que entre más podamos ser capaces de vivir con los otros y poder reconocerlos y hacerlos visibles y compartir de manera digna nuestras labores y reconocerlas como una actividad fundamental, pues entonces podremos llegar como a un balance como un poco más justo. Forzados a estar en nuestras casas en esta pandemia, sí nos hemos dado cuenta de lo imprácticos que se vuelven nuestros propios espacios domésticos, de lo innecesario que son muchas de las áreas que tenemos en casa, que ahora sí nos estamos haciendo responsables de producir nuestra comida y desechar nuestros desperdicios, que eran como dos partes de la ecuación que nos estábamos saltando. Bueno, o sea, ojalá esto como que nos lleve a tener una relación como mucho más consciente del valor del trabajo doméstico. Eso nos hará como pagar salarios más dignos, que haya seguro social para las trabajadoras y trabajadores domésticos, reconocer que también tienen que tener tiempos para su propia maternidad y para el propio cuidado de sus enfermos y de sus ancianos. Había una frase del Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar que era redistribuir, lo cual quiere decir que la esfera masculina se tiene que involucrar más en el tema de los cuidados, reconocer el trabajo de las personas que lo están haciendo de manera remunerada o sin remunerarse, y reducir. O sea, de pronto decimos, bueno, necesitamos todos estos espacios, y lo mismo con los platos, ¿no? El platito, el panel de la ensalada, el vaso, el vasito, el vasote. A lo mejor no necesitamos tanto para vivir mejor y tener mejores relaciones interpersonales, ¿no? En 2015, el trabajo doméstico no remunerado, ese que hacen las amas de casa, estuvo valorado en 21% del Producto Interno Bruto de México. Entonces, quiere decir que las mujeres están subsidiando gran parte de la economía nacional y que por eso están también limitadas en muchas de sus derechos. No tienen acceso a servicios de salud, no tienen un derecho a un retiro. Ellas siguen trabajando todo el año. Creo que la clave está como en las redes de solidaridad, ¿no? O sea, cuando hay grupos de personas que están en una situación de desventaja, lo que las fortalece más es compartir esas historias y poder otra vez como hacer un grupo que logre más cosas, ¿no? En la individualidad es muy difícil lograr nada, ¿no?
So, what elements make up the urban fabric? The answer depends on your concepts. You can think in terms of layers, you can think in terms of networks, you can think about different materialities. The usual answer is about the physical form and components of the city. the tangible objects like buildings and blocks, which you can see and you can touch. But even the physical dimension of the urban fabric is tricky because we walk through voids between walls. We walk between tangible objects and surfaces that you find, urban blocks, for instance, and buildings. So space is also the voids, is also continuous, and we navigate through it. And it is structured as a system. With the streets, we walk in the corridors and rooms where we live. The urban fabric contains other elements which are created by our minds and our actions, like meanings and activities and social contexts that we perform in space. Something we can call semantic information, which we enact in buildings and places. The idea of information as part of the urban fabric therefore opens up possibilities. We can use this information in our lives and actions. This information cuts across different materialities of space. So the built environment contains information, and different built environments contain different amounts of information. One way of understanding this is through a measure of entropy. Entropy is essentially a property of how unpredictable a system is, and this has to do with disorder. Disordered structures are highly unpredictable, so you can understand information in space by looking into how much order and predictability you can find in the built environment around you. We developed a measure to assess order in the built environment by counting the frequency of different combinations of cells of built form. High frequencies of particular combinations increase order. So we are likely to find higher amounts of order in cities and spatial cultures with strong top-down systemic planning. That is, planning which takes ensembles of buildings into account. We also managed to find a relation between information, entropy, and segregation in cities. If you understand social segregation as a form of restricting interactions, we can imagine that urban structures can have a role in social segregation. So differences of entropy between urban areas may create the conditions for the clustering of different social groups. So that means that the information about where you are likely to live and who you are likely to see on the streets may be encoded in the various spaces around you. So the urban form might encode social distancing in its very structure. So how can we transition to an urban experience without segregation? That's a key question for the future of our cities, of course, especially because we can see that segregation is such a pervasive feature of our cities and societies. In fact, humans are very good at creating differences between ourselves and creating spaces that reproduce those differences. So this requires us to think about how our cities work to both separate people and put them together. And we need some steps to do that. The first step is to understand that segregation has many dimensions. One of them is very well known, the segregation of places for different people, like the poor live over here, the rich live over there. But one of those dimensions is not so well known. And it's a very dynamic dimension. It's about how socially different people move through space, where they go, how their networks of movement may overlap or not in urban space. So if we look into those networks, we can better understand how we can overcome segregation and understand how urban space may foster encounters between socially different people. I think here of the location of major public services and how they are connected with transport systems, how these systems can be articulated in order to increase accessibility and stimulate people's mobilities, so that the networks of movement of different people can actually converge in the same spaces. And socially different people may experience each other in those spaces. So we need to think of segregation in a dynamic way.
children really can connect better when they move and play to understand and to nurture their curiosity and to team up with others. I really would love to see an education that allows children to understand why they care about everything, no, and what can they do about everything.
There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals designed to, equalize opportunity, really create the world that we all want to see created, which is equality for all. We only really have 10 more years to make a really big impact and change the world, because we've really borrowed it from our children and we've not done well. So we hopefully have time, and I hate to dwell in the space of anything negative, but you've really focused on the SDGs in the educational system and inspired so many children.
We have used the SDGs in a good way to translate them into play activities where children can connect with these very abstract issues through an education for sharing, which is a methodology that allows children and their communities to use play to understand the SDGs, why they care, to understand why civic values are so important to achieve these SDGs, and also to build a very strong platform of social emotional skills that in the end will also make you a happier person. What we do is we play also with teachers and parents. We train teachers very specifically, and we make sure that we invite parents to play the sessions where the SDGs come alive. And we have a play, reflect, and take action framework so that everyone is invited to have fun, feel a sense of belonging, have a healthy interaction, and then to stop and reflect. What is this? Why? What experience did I have during the game? And now what can I do with this experience?
At the UN, I work on youth engagement, but in the technology side of things. And we have a lot of youth now that are protesting, that are upset. And so it's such a pleasure to post a challenge and get them engaged on being part of the solution and engaging in a positive way where they can actually make change. We need to mentor kids. We need to mentor them all along the way, but not in a way that's teaching down to them. We need to empower them in different ways. And we need to actually show them that they can be part of the change that we need in the world.
We have to change the focus on the priorities, no? And really give value to what's valuable and to what really has a transcendental impact. Sure, empowering, having women empower themselves through lots of different channels is crucial. We wonder a lot, no? What will the jobs be like? How should we prepare our children and our youth? And it's fascinating because by definition the future is uncertain, but now it's more uncertain than ever before, and we really need to focus on how are we preparing our children to have the resilience, and to be problem solvers and to have all different avenues of understanding a same issue from different perspectives, almost having like a prism where you can see the different lights and colors and really come up with more creative solutions, more out of the box solutions, not conventional ways of, okay, this is how we do a rigid education, right? So that's why we need so much to transform the way that we are educating, to unleash that creativity that exists, but that we don't necessarily keep on nurturing. We have been so privileged to work with 1.3 million children, teachers, parents in the past 13 years, and we've replicated our methodology in 8 countries so far. It's remarkable and very inspirational how these kids are doing initiatives non-stop in their communities, and also very inspirational to see that the teachers really have that sense of ownership of the kind of teachers that they can be and what it feels like to play, to teach, and to learn, and to really have a more integrated sense of community when using something that usually is overlooked, like, oh, but it's only play. It's so sweet, and yeah, it's fun, but it's so powerful. And that's what we want to give as a gift to the teachers that honestly work so hard. They are my heroes. Teachers are my heroes, and they're anonymous heroes most of the times, but they really, we all have a teacher that left a very deep footprint in our lives. We can't only feel at ease by educating minds. We have to educate minds, but without educating the hearts, it's not gonna get where we dream of and where we need. It's not only a dream, it's also a need.
Cities are shaping the world. That's where the military power is. That's where the political power is. That's where the economic power is. That's where the scientific power is. The urbanites will define the future of nature. The urbanites will define the future of the countryside, of the food producing areas, through conscious political decisions or unconscious or maybe conscious market system by what they decide to buy and how they decide to spend their money. And yet urbanites are the most ignorant of that group of humans, of their dependence on nature to survive. So we figured out from a pragmatic point of view that we had to make a natural history museum, but make it urbanocentric, for the reason that urbanites have to understand how cities work and how they depend on nature in order to move forward. I'm a wildlife biologist by formation, and I've worked mostly with birds communities and studying how disturbances in mountain and cloud forest affect bird communities. That's been my main line of research. And so when I started designing this museum is when I started looking at the city different. Like most biologists or field biologists, cities are something that I disliked and that I really thought was the antonym of nature. Cities use over 0.5% of the energy of the world. They create, again, over half of the greenhouse gases. And cities are the ones that attract and use and consume energy, metal resources, carbon resources. So cities are the drivers in many ways of this overconsumption. And remind you that changes in the world have to do not just with human population growth, which is important, but also, and more importantly, with overconsumption by rich countries, mostly. So we have large inequity, both within countries and between countries, and that unfortunately is increasing, and thus eroding democracy, both worldwide democracy and also democracies within countries, which, by the way, is a major role of museums, strengthening democracy through an alternate way of education for citizens to make the best decisions. I see that museums have been evolving into these catalysts of change and linkage with communities, and leaving the ivory tower perspective that was more common before. In fact, there's a big debate right now in ICOM, in the International Council of Museums, about the new definition of museums. And there's no consensus, and they had to postpone the decision for more discussions. One of the major roles of museums is strengthening democracy. And that's maybe not a direct role, but an indirect role, but I think it's fundamental. And the way museums strengthen democracy is by, in essence, education without books, because it's a different way of learning. And so a role of the museum is creating these sensations that lead to emotions, that lead to feelings, that then people on their own, drive people on their own to search knowledge in different places, including the museum itself, which needs to offer it. Those first types of interactions have to be emotional to be important. Well, museums have been very, very badly affected by the pandemic. In a survey done by ICOM, by the International Council of Museums, 1 out of 8 museums that had to close during COVID will not open. They will be unable to open due to the economy.
It is only 3 decades ago that multilateral organizations believed inequalities were good for business, for competitive markets, for development. It was not only an economic decision or rational. It reflected a sort of sense of justice and equity. The same organizations 10 years later recognized that inequalities were linked to poverty and sustainable growth, and they hindered development and stalled progress. Despite all this, UN Habitat stated in a recent report that 75% of cities in the world grew more unequal economically in the last 20 years. However, the same study pointed out that these inequalities have to do with access to jobs, income, opportunities, assets, justice, resources. In sum, the opportunities that urban life creates. Recently, an inhabitant from Bogota told me, when you are poor, you are economically poor, you are socially poor, you are culturally poor, you are always poor. What we need is cities without inequalities. Less than 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum mentioned that inequality was a major threat to the world's stability. Stiglitz, in the same vein, mentioned that global unrest has a massive root cause inequality. He was correct. Popular demonstrations in cities from France, Spain, India, Colombia, Bolivia, Lebanon, Iraq, you name many other countries, are always connected by an invisible thread, soaring inequalities. What we need is cities without continuous social explosion, cities whose streets are taken to enjoy public space. But inequalities don't happen by accident, they are created. And this has been seen in the COVID world, that exacerbated inequalities, but at the same time took inequalities. This crisis has strongly exposed the inequalities between population and places. It's not a secret that the urban poor are much more exposed to the virus than other socioeconomic groups. They are more likely to die from COVID-19. Despite all this, equity still remains on the fringe of the political development agenda. Inequality matters, and SDGs Goal 10 is a reminder of this. Studies, however, as important as they are, Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, and others, all at country level, give a lot of prominence to education, taxation, redistributive policies, the protection of labor markets and workers, all which is important. However, this study from UN Habitat has shown that when a country reduces inequality or increases inequality, there is always something like 20, 30% of cities that go on opposite direction. This means that other elements are at play: geography, history, culture, local policies, local governance. We want cities without inequalities. But for that, we need a pathway of a just world, one that recreates new norms, social ethical pacts, that is based on an empathy revolution, and all this grounded in human rights. We need to define for the first time a framework of action for cities to fight inequalities, based on a public rationale, based on a different moral code, and a modern vision of human rights. Thank you.
So thank you all for attending the 4th Annual City Science Summit, The Power of Without. So it was a summit without co-location and a great opportunity to experiment with putting together a virtual meeting. I want to thank Maggie, who led the effort here at MIT, and Myra, that did an amazing job pulling it together in Guadalajara. So Myra.
Gracias. Estamos muy contentos de recibirlos en Guadalajara. Para nosotros esta es una gran oportunidad para compartir ideas, pensar en nuevas soluciones, para enfrentar los retos que nos esperan en el futuro para estas ciudades. Gracias y nos vemos mañana.
Thank you, everyone. It was an honor to work with you, and we look forward to much more with you, our team in Guadalajara.
Espero que hayan disfrutado este primer día del Summit. Por supuesto, nos hubiera gustado tenerlas y tenerlos físicamente. Esperemos que la primera oportunidad lo puedan hacer y nos vemos mañana en el segundo y también muy intenso día de este estupendo evento.
Thank you for joining the first day of the City Science Summit. Nos vemos mañana.
Muchas gracias, ha sido un honor estar con ustedes y asistiéndolos y participando en el Summit, y pues nos estaremos viendo en más las demás. Buen día.
Hope you enjoyed today y nos vemos los siguientes días y que lo disfruten mucho.
Gracias por acompañarnos, espero que lleguen muchas ideas de valor.
Thank you to all our panelists and participants. It's been a pleasure learning from you today.
Hola, gracias por acompañarnos, ha sido una gran experiencia. Esperamos que sigan disfrutando lo que queda de este Summit y nos vemos mañana en la Happy Hour también. Bye.
Ha sido un placer haberlos asistido y esperamos verlos muy pronto, ya sea en la Happy Hour o en las sesiones futuras. Hasta luego.
Gracias por ser parte. Enjoy.
Un placer haber pasado este día con vosotros y creo que estos 3 días juntos van a ser muy emocionantes. Nos vemos en la Happy Hour. See you in the Happy Hour.
¿Qué tal? Gracias por acompañarnos en este primer día, por este reto juntos a la distancia, y nos seguimos viendo en los siguientes días. Hasta luego.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. See you soon.
Nos vemos. Gracias.
Gracias.
Nos vemos.
Gracias.
Encontraste Canal 44, la señal de todos.
Un verdadero atleta es el que se supera día a día, vence todos los retos y se mantiene saludable y lejos de las adicciones. La mejor combinación es estar cerca del deporte y de la familia, en equilibrio de cuerpo, mente y espíritu, para conseguir tus metas. Para un verdadero atleta, su principal reto es mantenerse concentrado, nunca dudar, poniendo su espíritu y voluntad de campeón ante todo, con razón y corazón por toda la nación. Juntos por la paz.
En contraste, cobertura especial. Guadalajara es sede de la City Science Summit y este miércoles te invitamos a seguir nuestra transmisión de la Ceremonia Inaugural, una cumbre en la que líderes de opinión del campo de la ciencia comparten investigaciones, presentan nuevos proyectos y discuten su visión para crear comunidades más habitables y equitativas. Ceremonia Inaugural de City Science Summit, hoy a las 6 de la tarde.
En directo te escuchamos. En directo vamos a tu colonia. En directo estamos en la ciudad para evidenciar los problemas de fondo que afectan a tu comunidad. Hacemos contacto contigo para dar seguimiento puntual a tus denuncias en busca de que la autoridad no solo emita una respuesta, sino que resuelva el problema. En directo, nuevamente al aire a partir del lunes 5 de octubre, 3 de la tarde.
A continuación, señal informativa, emisión vespertina.